The dust had barely settled on the horizon when Harriet Turner first heard the jingle of spurs outside the dilapidated shed, where she'd been imprisoned for 3 days without food. Her parched lips cracked as she tried to call out, her voice barely above a whisper after days of screaming until her throat was raw. Arizona Territory, 1885. The merciless summer heat had turned the small wooden structure into an oven, and Harriet's once fine traveling dress now clung to her skin, soiled and damp with sweat. Her honey blonde hair hung in limp strands around her face, and her blue eyes, usually bright and determined, had grown dull with hunger and thirst. She hadn't expected treachery when she'd arrived in Copper Creek to claim her inheritance, her uncle's small but prosperous general store. What she hadn't known was that Mayor Franklin Price had been embezzling from her uncle for years, and her arrival threatened to expose his scheme. When she'd confronted him with the accounting discrepancies she'd discovered, his solution had been swift and brutal. His men had dragged her to this abandoned mining shed miles outside of town, locked her inside, and left her to die. Harriet pressed her ear against the rough wooden wall, barely daring to hope. The footsteps outside grew louder, then paused directly in front of the door. She heard the scratch of a match, followed by the smell of tobacco. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. "Is someone there? Please help me." The silence that followed was so profound that Harriet wondered if she'd imagined the sounds. Then a deep voice responded, "Madam, is someone in there?" "Yes," Harriet cried, summoning all her remaining strength. "I've been locked in here for days. Please help me." She heard movement outside, the sound of someone examining the heavy padlock that secured the door. "Stand back from the door, madam," the voice instructed. "I'm going to break this latch." Harriet scrambled backwards, nearly collapsing as her weakened legs threatened to give way beneath her. There was a moment of silence, then a deafening crack as something heavy struck the wooden door frame. Once, twice, and on the third strike, the sound of splintering wood filled the air as the rusty latch gave way. Sunlight flooded the dim interior of the shed, momentarily blinding Harriet. She raised a hand to shield her eyes, blinking rapidly as a tall silhouette filled the doorway. As her vision adjusted, she made out the figure of a man in a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, a bandana around his neck, and a wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over his face. He wore a gun belt slung low on his hips, and his boots were covered in trail dust. "My God," he murmured, taking in her condition. Without hesitation, he crossed the small space and knelt beside her. "How long have you been in here?" "3 days, I think," Harriet whispered. "They took my water yesterday." His jaw tightened, and in one fluid motion, he unscrapped a canteen from his belt and held it to her lips. "Slow sips," he cautioned as she grabbed for it desperately. "Too much at once will make you sick." The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but to Harriet, it was sweeter than any fine wine she'd ever tasted. She forced herself to drink slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "Who are you?" "Xavier Caldwell," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "Most folks just call me Zav." He looked around the shed with narrowed eyes, taking in the empty water bucket and the rope marks on her wrists where she'd been bound before being abandoned. "Who did this to you?" "Mayor Price," Harriet said, her voice strengthening slightly as anger flooded through her. "He's been stealing from my uncle's store for years. When I confronted him with proof, he had his men bring me here." Xavier's expression darkened. "Franklin Price, that explains a lot." He paused, then asked, "You're Matthew Turner's niece, aren't you? From Boston?" Harriet nodded, surprised. "You knew my uncle." Everyone in Copper Creek knew Matthew, good man. When he passed, folks were sorry to hear it. Xavier's eyes, a striking shade of green flecked with gold, studied her face. "I heard his niece was coming to settle his affairs, but when you didn't show up at the station, there was talk you'd changed your mind." "That was Price's doing," Harriet said bitterly. "His men intercepted me at the stage stop." Xavier's expression hardened. "Well, you're safe now, Miss Turner. Can you stand?" Harriet tried to rise but found her legs wouldn't support her weight. She swayed dangerously and Xavier caught her before she could fall. "That's enough of that," he said firmly. With surprising gentleness, he slipped one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. "I've got a camp about a mile from here. We'll get you some food and rest, then figure out what to do about Price." As Xavier carried her out of the shed and into the blinding Arizona sunshine, Harriet caught her first real glimpse of her rescuer. The man couldn't have been more than 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the western sun. A thin scar traced from his right temple to his jawline, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his cheeks. His hands were calloused but gentle as they held her. A chestnut gelding was tethered to a nearby juniper tree, watching them with curious eyes. Xavier whistled softly and the horse pricked its ears forward. "That's Rusty," Xavier told her as he approached the animal. "He's got good sense, which is why we're here at all. Noticed something about this shed when we passed by. Made a fuss until I came to check." He looked down at her, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Seems he's got better instincts than I do." With practiced ease, Xavier mounted the horse while still holding Harriet securely in his arms. She found herself cradled against his chest, her head resting just beneath his chin. Despite her ordeal, she felt a rush of awareness at their proximity. "Hold on," he murmured, adjusting her slightly so that she was secure. "Camp's not far." As Rusty picked his way carefully across the rocky terrain, Harriet felt the steady beating of Xavier's heart beneath her cheek. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe she might survive. "What brings you out here anyway?" she asked, her voice still rough from thirst and disuse. "This isn't exactly on the main trail." Xavier was quiet for a moment. "I'm tracking some men," he finally said. "Group that's been rustling cattle from the ranches around here. Thought I might find signs of them in these hills." "Are you a lawman?" Harriet asked, studying what she could see of his face from her position. A shadow crossed his features. "Used to be U.S. Marshal for the Arizona Territory until about 8 months ago. And now I work for myself." His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate further. They rode in silence after that, the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk the only sounds breaking the quiet. Harriet found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that the immediate danger had passed. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when Xavier's voice roused her. "We're here." Harriet opened her eyes to see a small camp nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees alongside a narrow creek. A canvas tent was pitched beneath the largest tree, and the remains of a small fire smoldered nearby. It was simple but tidy, the mark of a man accustomed to life on the trail. Xavier dismounted carefully, still cradling Harriet in his arms, and carried her to a bedroll spread beneath the tent's awning. With gentle hands, he set her down and immediately moved to the fire, stirring the embers and adding small pieces of kindling until flames licked upward once more. "Rest easy," he said over his shoulder. "I'll have some food for you shortly. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in you." Harriet watched as he efficiently went about preparing a meal, his movements economical and practiced. He filled a battered coffee pot with water from the creek and set it to boil, then retrieved a cloth-wrapped package from his saddlebags. "Jerky's too tough for you right now," he commented, returning to her side with a tin plate containing what looked like dried fruit, a small portion of beans, and a biscuit. "But this should sit easier on your stomach. Eat slowly." The simple food was better than any feast Harriet had ever tasted. She forced herself to take small bites and chew thoroughly, though her instinct was to devour everything at once. Xavier watched her with approval, nodding slightly as she paced herself. "You've got good sense," he remarked. "Most folks would make themselves sick eating too fast after going hungry." "This isn't my first experience with hunger," Harriet replied quietly. At his questioning look, she added, "After my parents died when I was 16, I lived with my uncle in Boston. But before he took me in, I spent several months in a charity house. The matrons there weren't always generous with portions." Xavier's expression darkened. "Seems you've had more than your share of hardship, Miss Turner." "Harriet," she corrected him, "and I've been more fortunate than many. Uncle Matthew gave me education and opportunity. That's why I can't let Price steal what rightfully belongs to me. It's all I have left of my uncle." Xavier nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Franklin Price has been the unofficial king of Copper Creek for too long. Uses the mayor's office to line his own pockets while pretending to work for the town's interests." He paused, adding more wood to the fire. "But he's careful, never does his own dirty work, always has men to handle the messy parts." "You seem to know a lot about him," Harriet observed. A muscle ticked in Xavier's jaw. "I've had dealings with him. None pleasant." He fell silent for a moment, then said, "You should rest now. We'll talk more when you've had some sleep." Harriet wanted to protest, to press for more information, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and the bedroll beneath her was the softest thing she'd felt in days. Despite her best intentions, she found herself drifting off, the last thing in her awareness the sound of Xavier moving quietly around the camp. When Harriet awoke, the sky had darkened to deep twilight, stars beginning to appear in the indigo expanse above. She lay still for a moment, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the day rushed back to her. Sitting up slowly, she found that her body ached less than before, though weakness still pervaded her limbs. Xavier sat by the fire, his attention focused on a knife he was sharpening with methodical strokes across a whetstone. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the furrow of concentration between his brows. "How long did I sleep?" Harriet asked, her voice stronger than before. Xavier looked up, setting aside his task. "About 4 hours. How do you feel?" "Better," she admitted, pushing herself to a more upright position. "Clearer." He nodded, satisfied, and moved to a pot that hung over the fire. "There's stew if you're up to it, and I've got coffee." "Both sound wonderful," Harriet said with genuine enthusiasm. Xavier brought her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of stew, then retrieved his own and settled on a fallen log nearby. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Harriet savoring each bite of the simple but hearty meal. "So," Xavier said finally, setting his empty plate aside, "we need to talk about what happens next." Harriet nodded, cradling her coffee cup between her palms. "I need to go back to Copper Creek. I have to claim what's rightfully mine and expose Price for what he's done." "It won't be that simple," Xavier cautioned. "Price practically owns that town. The sheriff's in his pocket, along with half the businessmen. Your word against his won't get far." "I have proof," Harriet countered. "My uncle kept detailed records. He suspected someone was stealing from him but couldn't prove who. I found entries in his personal journal about his suspicions, and when I compared his actual inventory and sales records to the official books, there were clear discrepancies, all pointing to Price." Xavier's expression shifted, interest kindling in his eyes. "And these records, where are they now?" "Hidden," Harriet said with a small smile. Uncle Matthew had a secret compartment built into the floor of the storeroom. I found it my first day there. When I realized what was happening, I made copies of the most damning evidence and hid them there before confronting Price. She paused. It was foolish of me to approach him directly, I see that now, but I was so angry. It was brave, Xavier corrected her. Foolhardy, perhaps, but brave nonetheless. He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging his hat slightly. But going back to town won't be safe for you. Price's men will be watching for you, and now they'll be desperate. If they realize you didn't die in that shed, they'll try again and be more thorough this time. Harriet straightened her shoulders. I won't be intimidated. My uncle built that business from nothing. It's all I have left of him and all I have to my name. I won't abandon it. Xavier studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I admire your determination, Miss Turner, Harriet, but we'll need to be smart about this. Price doesn't know I found you, which gives us an advantage. We can use that. Harriet questioned, hope rising in her chest. I have my own reasons for wanting to see Price get what's coming to him, Xavier said, his voice taking on a harder edge. And I don't make a habit of rescuing women from certain death only to abandon them afterward. Harriet smiled, the first genuine smile to cross her face in days. Thank you, Xavier. Zav, he corrected, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Only my mother called me Xavier, and only when I was in trouble. Zav then, Harriet agreed, feeling a strange flutter in her chest at the small intimacy of using his preferred name. So what's our plan? Zav leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. First, we need to get you back to full strength. That'll take another day or two. Then, we need to get into town without being seen and retrieve those records. After that, he paused, his expression turning grim. After that, we take them to someone who can actually do something about Price. The sheriff? No, Zav cut her off. Sheriff Dobbs is firmly in Price's pocket. Has been for years. But there's a federal judge who circuits through Prescott once a month. Judge Hammond. He's honest and he has no love for Price or his methods. If we can get your evidence to him, along with testimony about what was done to you, Price will finally face consequences. Harriet nodded, absorbing this information. And when is Judge Hammond next in Prescott? 4 days from now, Zav replied. Which gives us just enough time to recover your evidence and get there. The plan was straightforward enough, but Harriet could sense there was something Zav wasn't telling her. You said you have your own reasons for wanting to see Price brought down. What happened between you two? Zav's expression closed off, the openness of moments before disappearing behind a carefully neutral mask. That's a story for another time. For now, you should try to eat a bit more, then get some more rest. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you some fresh clothes and supplies. Harriet recognized the deflection but didn't press. This man had saved her life. She owed him the courtesy of respecting his privacy, at least for now. Instead, she asked, "Where will we get supplies? I don't have any money with me." "I've got enough to see us through," Zav assured her. "There's a small trading post about 10 miles from here, run by an old friend who knows how to be discreet. We can get what we need there without word getting back to Price." As night fully descended upon them, Zav insisted that Harriet take the tent while he slept under the stars. Despite her protests that she'd already imposed enough, he was firm. "You're still recovering," he pointed out reasonably, "and nights in the desert get cold, even in summer. The tent will keep you warmer." Too exhausted to argue further, Harriet eventually conceded. As she settled into the simple bedroll inside the canvas shelter, she found herself wondering about the enigmatic man who had saved her life. There was clearly more to Xavier Caldwell than met the eye pain behind those green-gold eyes that spoke of past wounds not fully healed. Outside, she could hear him moving around the camp, checking on the horse, banking the fire for the night. The sounds were oddly comforting, reminding her that she was no longer alone and vulnerable. For the first time in days, Harriet allowed herself to fully relax, and sleep claimed her quickly. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, the Arizona sun asserting its dominance early. Harriet awoke feeling remarkably improved, though still far from her full strength. She emerged from the tent to find Zav already up, coffee brewing over a freshly built fire. "Morning," he greeted her, handing her a tin cup of the strong black coffee. "Sleep well. Better than I have in days," Harriet admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Thank you." Zav nodded, turning his attention back to the pan of bacon sizzling over the fire. "Thought we'd head to Walter's trading post after breakfast. Get you some proper clothes and supplies before we make our next move." "Walter's your discreet friend?" Harriet asked, settling on a nearby rock. "Walter Simmons. Fought with my father in the war, then came west to start over. Runs the most isolated trading post in the territory, which suits him fine. He doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't repeat what he hears." Zav flipped the bacon with practiced ease. "If anyone can outfit us without word getting back to Price, it's Walter." After a breakfast of bacon, biscuits, and more coffee, they broke camp efficiently. Harriet insisted on helping despite Zav's protests, needing to feel useful after days of helplessness. Though her movements were slower than she would have liked, she managed to fold the bedroll and help pack the few cooking implements. Zav watched her with an appraising eye. "You're tougher than you look, Harriet Turner." "I'd have to be to survive in a man's world," she replied without rancor, tying her tangled hair back with a strip of cloth he'd provided. "Uncle Matthew taught me that a woman needs twice the resilience of a man to get half the respect." "Your uncle sounds like a wise man," Zav commented, securing the last of their gear to Rusty's saddle. "He was," Harriet said softly. "After my parents died of influenza in '73, he was all I had. He could have sent me to a girl's home or married me off to the first suitable candidate, but instead he taught me about business, accounting, self-reliance." She swallowed hard. "When he wrote that he was ill and wanted me to come west to take over the store, I didn't hesitate. I owed him everything." Zav paused in his work, studying her face. "And now you feel you owe it to him to see this through no matter the risk. Wouldn't you in my position?" He nodded slowly. "I would." With a sigh, he held out his hand to her. "Let's get moving then. We've got ground to cover." The ride to Walter's trading post took most of the morning. Harriet rode in front of Zav again, cradled against his chest as before. Though she felt slightly stronger, she knew she couldn't manage to ride on her own yet, and the closeness gave her an odd sense of security she wasn't ready to relinquish. They traveled through a landscape of stark beauty, rugged hills covered in sagebrush and mesquite, punctuated by the occasional cluster of cottonwoods or junipers near hidden water sources. Hawks circled overhead, and once they spotted a coyote watching them curiously from atop a rocky outcrop. "It's beautiful in its own way," Harriet observed as they crested a rise that afforded a view of the valley beyond. "Different from anything I've seen before." "The desert grows on you," Zav agreed, his voice rumbling against her back. "Seems harsh and unforgiving at first glance, but there's life everywhere if you know how to look for it. Resilience in every plant and creature. Is that why you stayed? After whatever happened with your martial position?" Zav was quiet for so long that Harriet thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Partly. Mostly because I'm not sure where else I'd go. The East never suited me, even before." He trailed off, then continued more firmly. "Out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his family was or what mistakes he's made in the past." At least, that's how it's supposed to be. Before Harriet could probe further, he pointed to a thin spiral of smoke rising from a cluster of buildings in the distance. "There's Walter's. We'll be there within the hour." Walter's trading post proved to be a collection of weathered wooden buildings nestled against a hillside, with a small corral for livestock and a garden plot irrigated by a spring that emerged from the rocks behind the main structure. As they approached, a tall, rangy man with a shock of white hair emerged from the largest building, a shotgun held casually in the crook of his arm. "That'll be far enough until I know who's coming," the man called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Zav reined Rusty to a halt and raised his free hand in greeting. "It's Xavier Caldwell, Walter, and a friend." The old man squinted at them, then lowered his shotgun. "Well, I'll be. Haven't seen you in months, boy. Thought maybe you'd finally gotten yourself killed." Despite the harsh words, there was genuine affection in the old man's voice. "Not yet," Zav replied, dismounting and helping Harriet down, though not for lack of trying on some folks' part. Walter's sharp eyes took in Harriet's disheveled appearance and the careful way Zav supported her. "Seems you've gotten yourself into another mess. Bringing trouble to my doorstep again, are you? Only the best kind," Zav assured him with a ghost of a smile. "Walter Simmons, meet Harriet Turner, Matthew Turner's niece from Boston." Walter's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Matthew Turner's kin. Heard tell his niece went missing on her way to claim his store." His gaze sharpened. "Price is doing, I'd wager." "You'd win that wager," Zav confirmed, leading Harriet toward the porch of the main building. "Found her locked in an abandoned mining shed out near Cooper's Canyon. 3 days without food, last day without water." Walter's weathered face darkened with anger. "That snake Price has been needing killing for years. Come on in, both of you. Miss Turner looks about ready to drop, and you look like you haven't slept proper in days yourself, Zav." The interior of the trading post was surprisingly well organized and clean, given its remote location. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabric to ammunition. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, and a counter ran along the back wall, behind which more specialized items were kept secure. Walter ushered them to a small table near the stove and disappeared momentarily into a back room, returning with a tray bearing a pot of tea and some biscuits. "My Martha's recipe," he explained, setting it down. "God rest her soul, best thing for restoring strength after a trial." Harriet accepted the cup of tea gratefully, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. Your kindness is most appreciated. Walter, please. Any kin of Matthew Turner's is welcome here." The old man pulled up a chair across from them. "Now, suppose you tell me what you two are planning that's got you looking over your shoulders." Zav glanced at Harriet, who nodded slightly. He proceeded to explain their situation and their plan to retrieve the evidence and take it to Judge Hammond in Prescott. Walter listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or frowning as the story unfolded. "It's a risky play," he commented when Zav finished. "Price won't take kindly to being exposed. He's got a lot to lose, and men with a lot to lose are dangerous." "We're aware of the risks," Harriet said firmly, "but I won't let him steal what my uncle built, and I certainly won't let him get away with trying to murder me." Walter studied her face, then nodded with approval. "You've got your uncle's backbone, that's clear enough." He turned to Zav. "And you're determined to see this through, even knowing what happened last time you crossed Price." A shadow passed over Zav's features. "Especially because of what happened last time." Walter sighed heavily. "Well, I can't say I'm surprised. You always did have more principles than sense." Despite the criticism, there was pride in the old man's voice. "What do you need from me?" "Supplies for a few days' travel," Zav replied. And some decent clothes for Miss Turner. Hers are worse for wear. And information, Harriet added. Has there been any news from Copper Creek? Do they know I'm missing or do they think I'm dead? Walter stroked his beard thoughtfully. Had a drummer come through yesterday on his way to Prescott. Said there was talk in Copper Creek that Matthew Turner's niece had taken ill suddenly and returned east. Price put it about that you'd found the desert air didn't agree with you. Harriet's eyes flashed with anger. So he's already trying to explain away my disappearance. That means he doesn't know I've escaped. Which works in our favor, Zav pointed out. If they're not looking for you, we have a better chance of getting into town unnoticed. Walter rose from his chair. I've got some clothes that should fit you, Miss Turner. My daughter left some things behind last time she visited, and I'll put together what else you'll need. He paused, looking at Zav with concern. You should rest here today, both of you. Head out at first light tomorrow. You've pushed yourself hard enough for one day, Zav, and the lady's still recovering. Zav looked like he wanted to argue but glanced at Harriet's pale face and nodded reluctantly. One night, we leave at dawn. After Walter had shown them to a small but clean back room where they could rest, and Harriet could change into fresh clothing, Zav stepped outside to tend to Rusty, leaving Harriet alone with her thoughts. The simple blue calico dress Walter had provided was a bit loose but clean and whole, a vast improvement over her ruined traveling dress. She was brushing out her tangled hair with a comb Walter had lent her when Zav returned, knocking lightly on the doorframe before entering. He paused when he saw her, something indefinable flickering in his eyes before he carefully composed his expression. You look better, he commented, setting down a bundle of supplies Walter had assembled for them. The color's coming back to your face. I feel more human, certainly, Harriet replied, continuing to work the comb through her hair. Though I fear my hair is beyond salvation without a proper washing. Zav cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. Walter says his daughter left some hair soap last time she visited. There's a washroom out back if you'd like to. That is, if you feel strong enough. Harriet couldn't suppress a smile at his obvious discomfort. Thank you. I would very much appreciate that opportunity. With directions to the washroom and the promised soap in hand, Harriet made her way to the small outbuilding behind the trading post. The washroom was simple, but offered the luxury of actual hot water, heated by a small stove in the corner. For the first time in days, Harriet was able to wash properly, scrubbing away the grime and sweat of her ordeal. As she worked the soap through her hair, Harriet found herself thinking about Zav. There was clearly more to his history with Price than he was willing to share, something personal that drove his determination to see the mayor brought down. The way Walter had mentioned, what happened last time, suggested a confrontation with serious consequences. And then there was the way he had looked at her just now, when he'd seen her in the clean dress with her hair partially tamed. It had been brief, but unmistakable, a flash of male appreciation quickly suppressed. Despite everything, Harriet had felt an answering flutter in her chest. It was inappropriate and ill-timed, she told herself firmly. They had far more important matters to focus on than any fleeting attraction between them. Still, as she rinsed the soap from her hair and dried off as best she could, Harriet couldn't help but wonder about the enigmatic former marshal who had saved her life. What had brought him to this point? What demons drove him? And why did the thought of parting ways with him, once their mission was accomplished, fill her with such unexpected dismay by the time she returned to the main building? Her hair still damp but clean and braided, Walter had prepared a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread. Zav was already seated at the table, deep in conversation with the older man, but both fell silent as she entered. Well now, you look like a new woman, Walter declared approvingly. "Sit and eat, Miss Turner. Nothing puts strength back like good food and rest." The meal passed pleasantly, with Walter sharing stories of the early days of the territory and his friendship with Harriet's uncle. It was clear the two men had been close, bound by mutual respect and shared experiences. Matthew was one of the few who stood up to Price from the beginning, Walter recalled, refilling their coffee cups. Most folks were just happy to have someone taking charge, bringing civilization to Copper Creek. Didn't look too closely at his methods. "That's how men like Price gain power," Zav commented, his voice hard. "They offer order and progress, and by the time people realize the cost, it's too late." Walter nodded sagely. "You should know. You've seen it from the inside." Harriet looked between them, curiosity burning. "What do you mean?" A tense silence fell over the table. Finally, Zav sighed and set down his cup. "I was U.S. Marshal for this district for 6 years. Worked closely with local law enforcement throughout the territory, including Sheriff Dobbs in Copper Creek. For a long time, I suspected something wasn't right there. Too many witnesses changing their stories, too many charges dismissed, too many blind eyes turned. But I couldn't prove anything." He paused, his expression growing distant. "Last year, I got a tip about a payoff between one of Price's men and Sheriff Dobbs. Cattle rustling case that mysteriously fell apart. I started digging, found connections to Price, had almost enough evidence to take to the federal prosecutor when..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "When what?" Harriet prompted gently. "When my deputy was murdered," Zav said flatly. "Young man named Thomas Cole. Good kid, eager to make a difference. Someone shot him in the back while he was collecting witness statements in Copper Creek. The only witness who would talk said it was a robbery gone wrong, but the timing was too convenient." "Price," Harriet breathed, understanding dawning. "I couldn't prove it," Zav continued, frustration evident in every line of his body. "And when I tried to pursue the investigation anyway, suddenly there were complaints about my conduct. Accusations of impropriety, misuse of authority. The territorial governor was pressured to request my resignation. I refused to go quietly, kept investigating on my own. That's when the second attempt came. Someone took a shot at me outside my office in Prescott, missed by inches. After that, the smart play would have been to leave the territory," Walter interjected. "But this stubborn fool decided to stick around, watching and waiting for a chance to bring Price down." Harriet studied Zav's face, seeing the pain and determination there. "So that's why you're helping me. You see this as your chance for justice for yourself and for your deputy." "Justice, revenge, sometimes the line blurs," Zav admitted. "But yes, your evidence could be the key to finally exposing Price for what he is, combined with my own testimony about the pattern of corruption I uncovered. It might be enough." Harriet reached across the table and laid her hand on his, a gesture of solidarity that surprised them both. "Then we'll do this together. For my uncle, for your deputy, and for everyone else Price has hurt." Zav's eyes met hers, and for a moment, something electric passed between them, a connection beyond their shared purpose, a recognition of kindred spirits. Then he nodded once, turning his hand to briefly squeeze hers before withdrawing. "Together, then," he agreed softly. Walter cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Well, now that that's settled, you both should get some rest. Dawn comes early and you've got a hard journey ahead." As night fell, Walter insisted they take the room with the 2 narrow beds, while he would sleep on a cot behind the counter, as he often did when staying late at the trading post. Despite her exhaustion, Harriet found sleep elusive, her mind racing with all she had learned about Zav and their dangerous undertaking ahead. Across the small room, she could tell from his breathing that Zav was equally awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. "Zav," she whispered, "are you afraid of what will happen when we confront Price?" There was a long silence, and Harriet thought he might not answer. Finally, his deep voice came through the darkness. "I'm not afraid of Price," he said slowly. "I'm afraid of failing. Again. Of someone else getting hurt because of my actions." "You mean me," Harriet realized. "Yes," Zav admitted. "I dragged you into this. You saved my life," Harriet corrected him firmly. "And I was already in this before we met. Price tried to kill me, remember? If anything, I've dragged you back into a fight you'd already been forced to abandon once." Another silence, then a soft chuckle. "You've got a way of seeing things clearly, Harriet Turner." "A gift from my uncle," she replied, smiling in the darkness. "He always said the truth was usually somewhere in the middle of any argument." "Your uncle sounds like a man I would have liked to know better," Zav said. "He would have liked you too," Harriet told him, certain of this despite having known Zav for only 2 days. There was something fundamentally honorable about him that her uncle would have recognized and respected. They fell silent after that, and eventually, Harriet drifted into sleep, comforted by the steady sound of Zav's breathing nearby and the knowledge that she was no longer facing her challenges alone. The next morning, they set out at first light as planned. Walter had provided them with ample supplies, fresh clothing for them both, and a second horse, a steady gray mare he insisted Harriet should ride. "She's called Dove," Walter told her as he helped adjust the stirrups to accommodate Harriet's shorter legs. "Gentlest creature I've ever known, but she's got spirit when needed. She'll serve you well." Harriet, feeling much stronger after a night of proper rest and several good meals, found she could indeed manage riding on her own now. The mare was as docile as promised, responding easily to even her inexperienced guidance. As they prepared to depart, Walter pulled Zav aside for a private word. Harriet couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Zav nod solemnly before clasping the older man's hand in farewell. "What did Walter say to you?" she asked as they rode away from the trading post, the morning sun casting long shadows across their path. Zav's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "He told me not to be a damn fool and get myself killed over old grievances, and to remember that some things are worth more than vengeance." "Wise advice," Harriet observed. "Walter's full of wisdom. Doesn't mean I always listen," Zav replied, but his tone was lighter than Harriet had yet heard from him. They rode at a steady pace throughout the morning, Zav leading them along less traveled paths to avoid any chance encounters with Price's men or others who might report their movements. By midday, they had covered significant ground, and Harriet was pleased to find that her strength continued to return, her body recovering remarkably quickly from her ordeal. As they stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack beside a small stream, Zav outlined their plan in more detail. "Copper Creek is about 15 miles southwest of here," he explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "We'll approach from the north after dark, circle around to avoid the main road. Your uncle's store is on the east end of town, yes?" Harriet nodded. "Just past the blacksmith's. There's a small alley that runs behind it, connecting to a service road." "Good. We'll leave the horses outside of town and go in on foot, less noticeable that way. Once we have the evidence, we head straight for Prescott. Judge Hammond arrives the day after tomorrow for the circuit court session." "And if we're discovered?" Harriet asked, needing to understand the full risk. Zav's expression grew serious. "Then we run. No heroics, no confrontations if we can avoid them. The evidence is what matters. If we're separated, head for Prescott on your own. Hammond is staying at the Palace Hotel." Harriet absorbed this, then asked the question that had been troubling her. "And after, assuming we succeed in exposing Price and reclaiming my store, what then?" Zav looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's for you to decide. The store will be yours free and clear. You could run it yourself as your uncle intended or sell it and return east." "I meant," Harriet clarified, her heart beating a little faster, "what will you do? Will you go back to being a marshal if your name is cleared?" "Honestly, I don't know," Zav admitted. "Haven't thought much beyond seeing Price get what's coming to him." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "But that's a concern for after we succeed, not before." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually shifting as they approached Copper Creek. The terrain became more rugged, dotted with the abandoned mining operations that had given the town its name decades earlier, before the copper veins had played out and cattle ranching had become the primary industry. As dusk began to fall, they reached a ridge overlooking the town itself, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with scattered houses and smaller structures extending outward. Lamps were being lit in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys against the darkening sky. "There it is," Zav said, reining Rusty to a halt. "Copper Creek. Not much to look at, but it's caused more than its share of trouble." Harriet studied the town where her uncle had spent his final years. From this distance, it looked peaceful enough, a typical frontier settlement trying to establish permanence in the harsh landscape. Hard to believe it harbored the kind of corruption and violence that had nearly cost her life. "My uncle's store is that building with the false front near the eastern end," she said, pointing. "You can just make out the sign Turner's General Merchandise." Zav nodded, his eyes scanning the layout of the town with professional assessment. "We'll wait until full dark, then approach from this side. There's a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile out where we can leave the horses." As they waited for night to fully descend, Harriet found herself growing increasingly nervous. Not so much about the danger, though that was real enough, but about what would come after. In just 2 days, her life had been completely upended, her understanding of her place in the world fundamentally altered. And at the center of that alteration stood Xavier Caldwell, a man who had saved her life and now risked his own to help her obtain justice. What would happen when this was over? Would they simply go their separate ways? The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Darkness finally enveloped the landscape, the town now visible only as scattered points of lamplight against the black backdrop of the desert night. Zav led them carefully down from the ridge, approaching the town in a wide arc to avoid being seen. As planned, they secured the horses in a dense stand of cottonwoods, ensuring they had water from a small seasonal creek that ran nearby. "Ready?" Zav asked as they prepared to cover the remaining distance on foot. In the darkness, his features were mostly shadow, but Harriet could see the tension in his posture, the alertness of a man anticipating trouble. "Ready," she confirmed, squaring her shoulders. The dress Walter had given her was practical for riding, but would also help her blend in if they were spotted, just another local woman going about her business, not the supposedly departed niece of Matthew Turner. They moved quietly through the night, Zav guiding them with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating in darkness. As they neared the outskirts of town, he pulled Harriet into the shadow of an abandoned shed as a rider passed by on the main road, the man's silhouette briefly visible against the lighter sky. "One of Price's men," Zav murmured once the rider had passed. Recognizing the outline of a man in the dark wasn't a skill Harriet possessed, but she didn't doubt Zav's identification. They continued their approach, now moving from shadow to shadow along the back lots and service alleys of the town. Music and voices drifted from the saloon on the main street, but the eastern end of town where Turner's general merchandise stood was quieter. Most businesses closed for the night. Finally, they reached the alley behind her uncle's store. The building loomed dark and silent, its back door secured with a heavy padlock. "Price must have had it locked up after you left town," Zav observed in a whisper. "Can you pick it?" Harriet shook her head. "I don't have the key. Uncle Matthew kept a spare, though." She moved along the back wall of the building, feeling carefully until her fingers found a loose board near the foundation. "Here." Prying the board away revealed a small cavity containing a key. Harriet retrieved it with a triumphant smile, holding it up for Zav to see. "Smart man, your uncle," Zav commented approvingly. The key turned easily in the padlock, and they slipped inside, carefully closing the door behind them. The interior of the store was pitch black, but Zav produced a small bull's-eye lantern from his coat pocket, shielding most of its light with his hand as he lit it. "Where's this hidden compartment?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harriet led him through the storage room, past shelves stocked with merchandise, to a section of plank flooring near the back wall. Kneeling, she pressed a particular knot in one of the boards, and with a soft click, a small section of flooring popped up slightly. "Uncle Matthew was quite proud of this," she whispered as she lifted the section to reveal a cavity beneath. "He designed it himself." Inside the hidden compartment lay a leather document case, which Harriet quickly retrieved. Opening it confirmed that the papers she had hidden there remained undisturbed, her copies of the ledgers showing the discrepancies, along with her uncle's journal entries detailing his suspicions. "Got them," she said with relief, securing the case and replacing the floor panel. "Now we just need to—" her words cut off as the sound of voices came from the front of the store, men talking, followed by the rattle of keys in the front door lock. Zav immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them back into darkness. "Back door," he whispered urgently, taking Harriet's arm to guide her. They had barely reached the storage room when light appeared under the door that separated it from the main part of the store. They froze as voices became more distinct. "Price wants this place cleaned out by tomorrow," a gruff voice was saying. "Says the bank's foreclosing since Turner's niece abandoned the property." "Seems mighty convenient," another voice replied. "First the old man dies, then the niece gets sick and leaves town right after finding some irregularities in the books. You questioning the mayor?" The first voice asked sharply. "No, just saying it's convenient is all," the second man backpedaled. "Let's get this done. I need a drink." Zav's grip on Harriet's arm tightened. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "We need to move. Now." They crept toward the back door, every step measured to avoid making noise on the wooden floor. Harriet clutched the document case to her chest, acutely aware that everything depended on getting these papers safely to Judge Hammond. They had almost reached the door when a board creaked loudly beneath Zav's foot. The voices in the front room fell silent immediately. "You hear that?" The gruff voice asked. "Back room," the second man confirmed. "Someone's back there." Zav didn't hesitate. "Run," he whispered, pushing Harriet toward the door. "Head for the horses, don't wait for me." Before she could protest, he moved away from her, deliberately making noise to draw attention to himself as Harriet slipped out the back door into the alley. She heard shouts behind her, followed by the sounds of a scuffle, but forced herself to keep moving as Zav had instructed. The evidence was what mattered. They had agreed on that from the start. Heart pounding, Harriet raced down the dark alley, clutching the document case. She had just reached the end when a gunshot cracked through the night, freezing her in her tracks. For a moment, she stood paralyzed with indecision. Then, remembering their plan, she forced herself to continue toward the stand of cottonwoods where they had left the horses. She had covered perhaps half the distance when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Diving into the cover of some scrub brush, Harriet pressed herself flat against the ground as riders passed, heading toward town. Price's men, no doubt, responding to the commotion. Once they had passed, Harriet continued her flight, reaching the cottonwoods breathless and trembling. Both horses were still there, calm and undisturbed in the darkness. She secured the document case in Dove's saddlebag, then hesitated, torn between her promise to continue to Prescott if they were separated and her reluctance to abandon Zav. "Come on, Zav," she whispered, straining to see through the darkness toward town. "Please be all right." Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Harriet was just about to mount Dove and head for Prescott alone when she heard someone approaching through the brush. She pressed herself against Dove's side, ready to flee, when Zav's voice came to her. "Harriet, it's me." Relief flooding through her, Harriet stepped forward. I'm here." Zav emerged from the shadows, moving with a slight limp but otherwise appearing unharmed. "You got away clean." "Yes," Harriet confirmed. "The papers are secure. I heard a gunshot. Are you hurt?" "Just a graze," Zav dismissed, though she could see now that he was holding his left arm awkwardly. "One of them got lucky, but I managed to confuse them about which way we went. They're searching the west side of town. We need to clean that wound," Harriet insisted, reaching for her saddlebag where Walter had packed medical supplies. "Later," Zav countered firmly. "Right now, we need to put as much distance between us and Copper Creek as possible. They'll figure out soon enough that we've got horses and which way we've gone." Recognizing the urgency, Harriet nodded and mounted Dove, securing the document case inside her jacket for added protection. Zav swung up onto Rusty with a barely suppressed wince that told Harriet his injury was more significant than he was admitting. They rode hard for several hours, following game trails and dry washes to avoid the main roads where Price's men might be searching for them. The moon rose, providing enough light to navigate by, though Zav set a punishing pace that tested Harriet's limited riding experience. She gritted her teeth against the discomfort and kept up, knowing that their lives and the chance for justice depended on reaching Prescott before they were caught. It was well past midnight when Zav finally called a halt in a secluded canyon with a small spring bubbling from the rocks. "We'll rest for a few hours," he decided. "The horses need it, and so do we. We've put enough distance between us and Copper Creek for now." As they dismounted, Harriet immediately turned her attention to Zav's injury. "Let me see that arm," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Zav sighed but complied, removing his jacket to reveal a blood-stained shirt sleeve. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm, leaving a nasty furrow that had bled considerably but didn't appear to have hit anything vital. "It looks worse than it is," he assured her as Harriet carefully cleaned the wound with water from the spring and antiseptic from their supplies. "It could easily become infected," Harriet countered, working efficiently to bandage the injury. "We'll need to change this dressing regularly." Zav watched her work, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "You've done this before," he observed. "Uncle Matthew believed a woman should know basic medical care," Harriet explained, securing the bandage. "Especially one who might end up running a store in a frontier town. He taught me what he had learned during the war." "Your uncle was an extraordinary man," Zav said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't know him better." "So am I," Harriet replied, her hands lingering on his arm a moment longer than strictly necessary. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing since he'd first broken the latch on that shed door and carried her to safety. Zav cleared his throat and looked away first. We should try to get some sleep. Dawn's only a few hours away, and we've got hard riding ahead of us tomorrow. They set up a simple camp, not risking a fire that might be spotted. Harriet spread her bedroll near Zav's, close enough for safety but maintaining a proper distance. As she lay down, exhaustion from the day's events washed over her, but her mind continued to race with thoughts of what had happened and what still lay ahead. "Zav," she ventured after a few minutes of silence. "Why did you really come looking for cattle rustlers in that remote area where you found me? It seems unlikely that you would have been there by pure chance." There was a long pause, and Harriet wondered if he had already fallen asleep. Finally, his voice came through the darkness. "I received an anonymous note," he admitted, "left at Walter's trading post for me. It said there was evidence of Price's corruption hidden in an abandoned mining camp near Cooper's Canyon. I went to investigate." "A trap," Harriet suggested, understanding dawning. "Most likely," Zav agreed. "But not the kind they intended. Instead of finding fabricated evidence meant to discredit me further, I found you. So Price sent you there, thinking you'd find something that would damage your reputation even more. And instead, you found his greatest mistake," Harriet said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Ironic, isn't it?" Zav replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Price's attempt to destroy me may end up being his undoing." Harriet pondered this, connecting the pieces. "He must have been confident I was already dead, or would be soon. Otherwise, why risk drawing you to that area? Pride," Zav said simply. "It's always been his weakness. He enjoys his games, his manipulations. Probably thought it would be the perfect final move against me, lead me to a remote location on a wild goose chase, further discrediting me when I came back with baseless accusations." "Instead, you came back with me," Harriet murmured. "Instead, I found you," Zav corrected softly. "And that changes everything." The significance of his words settled over Harriet like a warm blanket. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to admit. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew that finding Xavier Caldwell or him finding her had altered the course of her life irrevocably. "Get some sleep, Harriet," Zav said gently. "Tomorrow we end this." "Tomorrow," she echoed and closed her eyes, allowing exhaustion to finally claim her. They were on the move again before dawn, pushing hard toward Prescott. According to Zav, they should reach the town by late afternoon if they maintained a good pace. The terrain grew increasingly mountainous as they rode, the desert giving way to pine forests and higher elevations. By midday, they had seen no sign of pursuit, but Zav remained vigilant, frequently checking their back trail and choosing paths that would be difficult to follow. Harriet's muscles ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she made no complaint, determined to keep up. "How's the arm?" she asked during a brief stop to rest the horses. "Manageable," Zav replied, though she noticed he winced slightly when moving it. "Walter packed some willow bark tea in the supplies. Helps with the pain." Harriet nodded, relieved that the bleeding had stopped and the wound showed no signs of infection so far. "We're making good time, aren't we?" "Better than I expected," Zav confirmed. "Should reach Prescott by sunset." "Judge Hammond will have arrived today, but the court session doesn't begin until tomorrow morning. We'll go directly to the Palace Hotel when we arrive." As they continued their journey, the landscape opened up occasionally to offer spectacular views of distant mountains and valleys. Despite the urgency of their mission and the lingering threat of pursuit, Harriet found herself captivated by the wild beauty of the territory. "I can see why you love it here," she commented as they paused at the crest of a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of pine forest. "It's nothing like Boston." It gets in your blood, Zav agreed, his expression softening as he gazed at the landscape. The openness, the freedom of it, room to breathe. Is that why you stayed even after everything that happened? Harriet asked. Zav considered this, absently stroking Rusty's neck. Partly. Also stubbornness, I suppose, didn't want to be run off by the likes of Price. He glanced at her, his eyes searching her face. What about you? You planning to stay and run your uncle's store once this is over, or head back east? The question caught Harriet off guard, though she'd been thinking about it herself. I haven't decided, she admitted. When I first came west, I intended to settle permanently, take over Uncle Matthew's business, make a life here. Then Price happened, and surviving became my only goal. She paused, then added more softly, now, I'm not sure what I want. Something flickered in Zav's eyes, hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. Before he could respond, however, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Zav immediately tensed, hand going to his gun as he scanned the trail behind them. Riders coming, he said tersely. At least 3 moving fast. Price's men, Harriet asked, fear shooting through her. Most likely, Zav confirmed grimly. They must have figured out we're headed for Prescott. He made a quick decision. We need to split up. I'll lead them away while you continue to Prescott with the evidence. No, Harriet protested. That's too dangerous. They'll kill you if they catch you. They won't catch me, Zav assured her with more confidence than she suspected he felt. I know these mountains better than they do, but you need to get those papers to Judge Hammond. Harriet wanted to argue further, but she recognized the logic of his plan. The evidence was what mattered. They had agreed on that from the start. Still, the thought of leaving him to face Price's men alone filled her with dread. Promise me you'll be careful, she insisted, reaching out impulsively to grasp his hand. Promise me you'll come to Prescott when you've lost them. Zav's fingers tightened around hers. I promise, he said solemnly. Now go, follow this ridge to the east. It joins the main road to Prescott in about 3 miles. From there, it's a straight shot to town. Ask for Judge Hammond at the Palace Hotel. Harriet nodded, memorizing the instructions. Then, driven by impulse and the fear that she might never see him again, she leaned forward in her saddle and pressed a swift kiss to his cheek. For luck, she whispered. Surprise and something deeper flashed in Zav's eyes, but he merely nodded, his expression turning resolute. Ride hard and don't look back, he instructed, then wheeled Rusty around and headed down the ridge at a gallop, deliberately making enough noise to attract the attention of their pursuers. Heart pounding, Harriet watched him go, then turned Dove to the east as instructed and urged the mare forward. The document case was secure inside her jacket, pressed against her heart like a talisman. She would get it to Judge Hammond, she vowed silently. For her uncle, for Zav, and for justice. The ride to Prescott seemed interminable, though in reality it took less than 3 hours. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Harriet finally caught sight of the territorial capital, a substantial town, nestled in a valley, surrounded by pine-covered mountains. Unlike Copper Creek, Prescott boasted brick buildings along its main streets, a proper courthouse, and an air of permanence and prosperity. Following Zav's directions, Harriet made her way to the Palace Hotel, a 3-story structure with a columned front entrance that would have looked at home in a much larger city. She dismounted stiffly, her body protesting after 2 days of hard riding, and tied Dove to the hitching post before ascending the steps to the hotel entrance. The lobby was elegantly appointed with polished wood furnishings and patterned carpets. A clerk looked up as Harriet approached the front desk, his eyebrows rising slightly at her trail-worn appearance. "May I help you, miss?" he inquired, his tone politely dubious. "I need to see Judge Hammond," Harriet stated firmly. "It's an urgent legal matter," The clerk's expression became even more skeptical. "Judge Hammond is not receiving visitors this evening. Perhaps you could return in the morning when the court is in session." "This cannot wait until morning," Harriet insisted, drawing herself up to her full height despite her exhaustion. "Please inform the judge that Harriet Turner, Matthew Turner's niece, needs to speak with him regarding corruption in Copper Creek involving Mayor Franklin Price. It is a matter of life and death." The mention of Price's name caused a flicker of recognition in the clerk's eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Wait here, please." As the clerk disappeared up the grand staircase, Harriet sank gratefully onto a nearby settee, the document case clutched tightly in her lap. She was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, the dust-covered dress, her hair escaping from its braid, the general air of someone who had been riding hard for 2 days. But none of that mattered now. She had made it to Prescott with the evidence. All that remained was to convince Judge Hammond of its significance. And Zav, where was he now? Had he successfully eluded Price's men, or was he lying wounded or worse somewhere in the mountains? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The clerk returned after several minutes, his manner noticeably more respectful. "Judge Hammond will see you now, Miss Turner. If you'll follow me." Harriet rose, summoning her remaining strength, and followed the clerk up the staircase to the second floor. He led her to a suite at the end of the hallway and knocked briefly before opening the door. "Miss Turner, Your Honor," he announced, then stepped aside to allow Harriet to enter. Judge Ezekiel Hammond was a tall, lean man with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything about Harriet in a single glance. He stood beside a desk covered in legal papers, wearing a formal suit despite the hour. "Miss Turner," he greeted her, his voice deep and measured. "I understand you have information regarding Mayor Price of Copper Creek." "Yes, Your Honor," Harriet confirmed, stepping forward and opening the document case. "Evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and I believe murder." The judge's eyebrows rose, but he gestured for her to continue. For the next half hour, Harriet laid out the case against Price, the discrepancies in her uncle's store accounts, the pattern of theft that had been going on for years, her own confrontation with Price that had led to her imprisonment, and finally, the connection to the murder of Zav's deputy and the subsequent smear campaign against the former marshal. Judge Hammond listened without interruption, examining each document as she presented it, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she had finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "This is most disturbing, Miss Turner," he said finally. "If what you say is true, and the evidence certainly suggests it is, Franklin Price has been engaged in criminal activity for some time, using his position as mayor to cover his tracks. He tried to have me killed," Harriet reminded him. "Left me to die in an abandoned mining shed without food or water." "Yes, and that alone would warrant serious charges," the judge agreed, "combined with the financial crimes and the potential connection to Deputy Cole's murder." He shook his head grimly. "This requires immediate action." "There's more," Harriet added, her voice catching slightly. "Xavier Caldwell, the former marshal who rescued me and helped me obtain this evidence, may be in danger right now. Price's men were pursuing us as we headed for Prescott. He drew them off so I could get here safely." A look of recognition crossed the judge's face. "Caldwell. Yes, I remember the case. There were allegations of misconduct, but nothing substantial ever materialized. I always found that curious, given his reputation." "The allegations were fabricated," Harriet said firmly. "Part of Price's effort to discredit him when he got too close to the truth." Judge Hammond nodded slowly. "That would explain a great deal." He rose from his chair, decision made. Miss Turner, I'm going to place these documents in my safe for tonight. In the morning, I will issue warrants for Franklin Price's arrest on multiple charges, including attempted murder, embezzlement, and fraud. I'll also send deputies to search for Marshall Caldwell. Relief flooded through Harriet, leaving her suddenly lightheaded. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge studied her face with concern. You appear exhausted, Miss Turner. Have you made arrangements for lodging? Harriet shook her head. I came directly here from the trail. Then allow me to secure a room for you here at the hotel, Judge Hammond offered. You should rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day, and we'll need your testimony when Price is brought in. Too tired to argue, Harriet gratefully accepted the judge's assistance. Within the hour, she found herself in a comfortable room with a proper bed, clean clothing provided by the hotel's laundry service, and a hot meal sent up from the restaurant downstairs. After washing away the dust of the trail and changing into a borrowed nightgown, Harriet fell into bed, her last conscious thought a prayer for Zav's safety. She awoke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of activity in the street below. For a moment, she was disoriented, then the events of the previous days came rushing back. Sitting up quickly, Harriet checked the small clock on the bedside table. 9 o'clock. She had slept much longer than intended. Dressing hastily in the clean clothes provided by the hotel, Harriet made her way downstairs to inquire after Judge Hammond. She was directed to the courthouse across the street, where she found the judge already in his chambers, preparing for the day's proceedings. "Ah, Miss Turner," he greeted her. "I trust you rested well. You certainly look much improved." "Thank you, Your Honor," Harriet replied. "Has there been any word about Xavier Caldwell?" The judge's expression grew serious. "I dispatched deputies at first light to search for him along the trail from Copper Creek. We've had no word yet." Seeing her concern, he added, "Marshall Caldwell is resourceful by all accounts. I wouldn't give up hope." Harriet nodded, trying to take comfort in the judge's words. "And what of Price?" "I've issued the warrants," Judge Hammond informed her. "Deputies are riding for Copper Creek as we speak. Price should be in custody by nightfall." The day passed with excruciating slowness for Harriet. Judge Hammond insisted she remain at the courthouse where she would be safe, in case Price had sent men to Prescott to look for her. She gave a formal deposition about the events in Copper Creek, answered countless questions from the territorial prosecutor, and waited anxiously for news of either Zav or Price's arrest. It was late afternoon when a commotion in the courthouse corridor drew her attention. Rising from her seat in the small anteroom where she had been waiting, Harriet moved to the door just as it opened to reveal Judge Hammond, his expression grim. "What is it?" she asked, her heart sinking. "Has something happened?" "Price is gone," the judge informed her. When the deputies arrived in Copper Creek, they found he had fled, taking several of his men with him. They left early this morning, according to the town's telegraph operator. "He knows," Harriet realized. "Somehow he knows we made it to Prescott with the evidence." "It would seem so," Judge Hammond agreed. "The deputies are tracking him, but he had a significant head start." Harriet's mind raced. "If Price is fleeing, that means—" She looked up sharply. "Zav, he must have evaded Price's men yesterday, or they would have known we'd split up." "A reasonable deduction," the judge concurred. "The question is where Price would go. He can't return to Copper Creek now, not with these charges pending." "The border," Harriet suggested. "Mexico isn't far and extradition would be difficult, especially if he has money hidden away." Judge Hammond nodded thoughtfully. "A likely possibility. I'll send word to the border stations to be on the lookout." He hesitated, then added more gently, "There's still no word from the deputies searching for Marshall Caldwell, but they'll continue looking." Harriet thanked him, trying to maintain her composure despite the growing fear for Zav's safety. As evening approached, she returned to the hotel, though she knew sleep would be elusive. The victory that had seemed so close now felt hollow with Price on the run and Zav still missing. She was standing at the window of her hotel room watching the street below without really seeing it, when a knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Heart suddenly racing, Harriet crossed the room and called out, "Who is it?" "Hotel clerk, madam," came the reply. "Message for you." Cautiously, Harriet opened the door. The young clerk stood there with an envelope in hand. "This just came for you, Miss Turner. The gentleman was most insistent it be delivered immediately." "Gentleman," Harriet repeated, accepting the envelope. "What gentleman?" "Didn't give his name, madam," the clerk replied with a shrug. "Rough-looking fellow, trail dust all over him. Said it was urgent you get this right away." Harriet's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope after the clerk had departed. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in a bold, masculine hand. "Price headed for Willow Creek. Meeting buyers for stolen cattle. Will try to cross into Mexico from there. Following at a distance. Meet me at Walter's tomorrow if you can." Relief flooded through Harriet so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Zav was alive. He had evaded Price's men and was now tracking the mayor himself. But Willow Creek, that was near the border, at least a day's hard ride from Prescott. By the time deputies could be dispatched, Price might be gone. Making a swift decision, Harriet gathered her few belongings and the money Judge Hammond had provided for her expenses. She would leave for Walter's trading post at first light. From there, she and Zav could determine their next move. She penned a quick note to the judge explaining what she had learned and her decision to meet with Zav, then arranged for it to be delivered in the morning. Sleep came fitfully that night, her mind too full of possibilities and dangers to fully rest. Before dawn, Harriet was up and dressed, making her way to the livery where Dove had been stabled. The stableman was reluctant to saddle the horse for a woman traveling alone so early, but Harriet's determined manner and generous payment overcame his objections. The ride to Walter's trading post took most of the day, though Harriet pushed Dove harder than was perhaps wise. The mare was sturdy and willing, however, and they made good time across the rugged landscape. As the familiar cluster of buildings came into view in the late afternoon, Harriet felt a surge of anticipation mingled with uncertainty. Would Zav be there? Or would she find only Walter, holding another message about a further delay? As she approached the trading post, a figure emerged from the main building, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakable even at a distance. Her heart leapt at the sight of Zav standing on the porch, watching her approach. He looked tired and dusty from the trail, his left arm still bandaged but wonderfully, blessedly alive. Without conscious thought, Harriet urged Dove into a faster pace for the final distance. As she reached the yard, Zav stepped forward to help her dismount, his hands strong and steady as they gripped her waist and lifted her down. Before her feet had even touched the ground properly, Harriet found herself wrapping her arms around him in a fervent embrace, propriety forgotten in the relief of finding him safe. "Thank God," she murmured against his chest. "I was so afraid when you didn't come to Prescott." Zav's arms tightened around her briefly before he gently set her back, his eyes searching her face. "I couldn't risk leading Price's men there," he explained. "Had to make sure they followed me instead of tracking you." Walter appeared in the doorway of the trading post, a broad smile splitting his weathered face. "Well now, ain't this a sight for sore eyes, both of you in one piece more or less?" He gestured them inside. "Come on in. Got coffee hot and stew on the stove." You can tell me how you managed to turn the whole territory upside down in just 3 days. Over the meal, Zav explained what had happened after they separated. He had successfully led Price's men on a wild chase through the mountains, eventually losing them in a maze of canyons. By the time he had circled back to the trail, night had fallen. Rather than risk the dark mountain paths to Prescott, he had decided to head for Walter's trading post to rest and recover. That's when I heard about Price fleeing Copper Creek, he continued. Walter got the news from a drummer who came through. Said Price and 4 of his men had cleared out in a hurry, taking several horses and supplies. Judge Hammond sent deputies after him, but they had no idea where he was headed, Harriet added. Zav nodded grimly. I had a hunch. Price has been using his position to facilitate cattle rustling for years. The stolen herds are driven south, across the border, and sold in Mexico. Willow Creek is a regular meeting spot for these transactions. How do you know this? Harriet asked. It was part of what I was investigating before. Zav hesitated, then continued. Before Thomas was killed, we had informants who told us about the operation, but never enough evidence to prove Price's involvement. His jaw tightened. If Price is running, he'll need money, a lot of it. The cattle sale at Willow Creek could set him up nicely for a new life in Mexico. When is this sale supposed to take place? Walter asked, refilling their coffee cups. Tomorrow, Zav replied, which doesn't leave much time. Even if Judge Hammond dispatched men as soon as he got my message, they won't reach Willow Creek in time. So what do we do? Harriet questioned, already suspecting the answer. Zav's eyes met hers, determination evident in their depths. I'm going after him myself. I know the area, I know his operation. I can get there before the sale and make sure he doesn't escape justice again. You mean we're going after him? Harriet corrected firmly. Zav's expression shifted to one of concern. Harriet, this is too dangerous. Price is desperate now, cornered. That makes him unpredictable. I'm already involved, Harriet pointed out. He tried to kill me, remember? I have as much right to see this through as you do. She leaned forward, her voice softening slightly. Besides, 2 witnesses are better than 1, and you're still injured. Walter, who had been listening to this exchange with interest, cleared his throat. She's got a point, Zav, and the lady's proven she can handle herself under pressure. When Zav still looked unconvinced, Walter added, I could go with you both. 3 guns are better than 1, especially when one of those guns has a bum arm. Zav glanced between them, clearly recognizing he was outnumbered. Harriet stays at a safe distance, he stipulated finally. No heroics, no confrontations. We observe and wait for the deputies if possible. Agreed, Harriet said quickly before he could change his mind. When do we leave? First light, Zav decided. It's about 15 miles to Willow Creek. We'll need to approach carefully, set up where we can observe without being seen. As Walter busied himself gathering supplies for their journey, Harriet found herself alone with Zav for the first time since their reunion. He was studying a rough map spread out on the table, his expression focused and distant. I was afraid for you, Harriet admitted quietly, breaking the silence between them. When you didn't come to Prescott, and then when I heard Price had fled. Zav looked up, his expression softening. I'm sorry I worried you. I wanted to get to Prescott, but Price's men were persistent. By the time I lost them, it made more sense to come here. He paused, then added more softly, I thought about you the whole time, wondering if you'd made it safely, if you'd convinced the judge. I did, Harriet confirmed. Judge Hammond believed me immediately, said the evidence was compelling. You did well, Zav said with genuine admiration. Better than I could have hoped. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and growing feelings. Finally, Harriet voiced the question that had been on her mind since their separation. What happens after this is over, Zav. After Price is brought to justice. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly. I've been thinking about that. If my name is cleared, if Judge Hammond believes my side of what happened with Deputy Cole's murder, I might have a chance at getting my position back. Or at least finding work in law enforcement again. Is that what you want? Harriet asked, watching his face carefully. Zav was quiet for a moment, considering. It's what I know, what I'm good at, but... He hesitated, then continued more deliberately, but there are other considerations now, things I hadn't counted on. Such as, Harriet prompted, her heart beating a little faster. You, Zav said simply, his gaze unwavering. Meeting you changes things, Harriet. Makes me think about possibilities I hadn't considered before. Before Harriet could respond, Walter returned with an armload of supplies, effectively ending their private conversation. But Zav's words lingered in her mind as they prepared for the journey ahead, filling her with a cautious hope that extended beyond the immediate challenge of bringing Price to justice. They set out at dawn as planned, the three of them riding single file along narrow trails that Zav assured them would avoid any chance encounters with Price or his men. Walter, despite his age, proved to be a capable horseman and an easy traveling companion, filling the journey with stories of the early days of the territory that helped distract Harriet from her growing nervousness about the confrontation that lay ahead. By midday, they had reached the vicinity of Willow Creek, a secluded valley with a year-round stream running through it, surrounded by low hills that provided natural cover for clandestine meetings. Zav led them to a vantage point atop one of these hills, where they could observe the valley floor without being easily spotted. There, he said quietly, pointing to a cluster of cottonwoods near a bend in the creek. That's where the exchanges usually happen. Good cover, multiple escape routes, water for the cattle. Harriet squinted against the sunlight, making out what appeared to be several horses tethered in the shade of the trees. Is that them? Price and his men? Looks like it, Zav confirmed, his expression grim. I count 5 horses. Price and his 4 men, most likely. No sign of the Mexican buyers yet, or the stolen cattle. Walter, who had been scanning the surrounding hills with a small spyglass, grunted softly. Cattle are probably being held in that box canyon to the south. Would keep them contained and out of sight until the buyers arrive. What's the plan? Harriet asked, keeping her voice low though they were well out of earshot of the men below. Zav considered for a moment. We wait. Watch. If the buyers show up before the deputies, we'll need to intervene to prevent the sale. Otherwise, Price will have the money he needs to disappear completely. And if the deputies arrive first, Harriet questioned, then we stay put and let them handle it, Zav replied firmly. No unnecessary risks. They settled in to wait, taking turns watching the camp below through Walter's spyglass. Hours passed with little activity, though occasionally they could see men moving among the trees, apparently preparing for the expected transaction. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Walter, who was on watch, suddenly stiffened. Riders coming, he murmured. From the south, 6 men driving about 30 head of cattle. Zav took the spyglass, focusing on the new arrivals. Mexican buyers, he confirmed grimly. Still no sign of the deputies. Harriet felt her heart sink. So we have to intervene. We, Zav corrected, will stay here. Walter and I will go down. You'll remain as our lookout. If deputies approach from the north, fire 2 shots in the air to signal us. Harriet wanted to protest, but knew this was not the time to argue. She nodded reluctantly, accepting the small revolver Zav handed her from his saddlebag. Be careful, she urged as the 2 men prepared to descend to the valley floor. Price is dangerous, more so now that he's cornered. We'll approach from different directions, Zav explained. Create confusion, make them think there are more of us. The goal is to stall until help arrives, not to engage in a prolonged gunfight. With that, he and Walter moved off, leading their horses down separate paths that would bring them to opposite sides of the meeting place by the creek. Harriet watched them go, her heart in her throat, then turned her attention to the northern approach, straining her eyes for any sign of the deputies Judge Hammond had promised to send. From her vantage point, she could see the Mexican buyers approaching the cottonwood grove, the small herd of cattle moving sluggishly in the late afternoon heat. As they neared, several figures emerged from the trees to meet them, Price and his men, preparing to complete the transaction that would fund their escape. Harriet held her breath, watching as Zav and Walter closed in from opposite directions, still unnoticed by either party. The negotiation below appeared to be proceeding, with Price and the lead Mexican buyer engaged in conversation while their respective men kept watch. Then everything happened at once. Zav broke from cover, his gun drawn, shouting something Harriet couldn't make out at this distance. Simultaneously, Walter appeared from the opposite direction, his shotgun raised. The cattle, startled by the sudden commotion, began to scatter, adding to the confusion. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, the sharp cracks echoing across the valley. Harriet could see Price's men diving for cover, returning fire, while the Mexican buyers retreated toward their horses. Price himself stood his ground momentarily, then made a dash for the trees. Harriet watched in horror as Zav pursued him, exposed and vulnerable in the open ground between them. A shot rang out, and Zav stumbled but kept moving, disappearing into the tree line after Price. More gunfire followed, a chaotic exchange impossible to track from her position. Her attention was so focused on the scene below that she almost missed the dust cloud approaching from the north. Raising the spyglass, Harriet felt a surge of relief as she made out a group of riders wearing badges, the deputies, finally arriving. She fired 2 shots into the air as instructed, hoping to alert Zav and Walter to the approaching reinforcements. The deputies, hearing the gunfire, spurred their horses to a gallop, closing the distance rapidly. As they thundered into the valley, most of Price's men threw down their weapons, recognizing the futility of resistance. The Mexican buyers had already fled, driving the scattered cattle before them in their haste to escape. But there was no sign of Price or Zav. Heart pounding, Harriet mounted Dove and made her way down to the valley floor, caution forgotten in her fear for Zav's safety. As she approached the cottonwood grove, she could see Walter speaking urgently with the lead deputy, pointing toward a trail that led away from the creek into rougher terrain. "Walter," she called, dismounting quickly. "Where's Zav? What happened?" The old man turned, his expression grave. Price ran. Zav went after him up into those rocks. He pointed to a rocky outcropping beyond the trees. "I think Zav was hit, but he kept going." "We've got men following their trail now, madam," the deputy informed her. "If they're up there, we'll find them." Harriet shook her head, unable to accept the passive role. "I'm going too." Before either man could protest, she was back on Dove, urging the mare toward the path Zav and Price had taken. She heard Walter call after her but didn't slow down. If Zav was injured, every moment counted. The trail wound up through increasingly rocky terrain, narrow and treacherous in places. Harriet followed as quickly as she dared, listening for any sound that might guide her. After perhaps a quarter mile, she heard voices ahead raised in argument and slowed Dove to a walk. Approaching more cautiously, rounding a bend in the trail, Harriet came upon a small clearing bordered by massive boulders. In the center stood Price, his back to a sheer rock face, a gun in his hand. Facing him, partially sheltered behind a boulder, was Zav. Even from a distance, Harriet could see the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder, fresh blood soaking through his shirt. "It's over, Price," Zav was saying, his voice strained but steady. "Deputies are down there right now, rounding up your men. There's nowhere left to run." Price laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "Maybe not. But I can still make sure you don't live to see me hang, Caldwell. You've been a thorn in my side for too long." "That won't change anything," Zav countered. "Harriet Turner made it to Judge Hammond with the evidence. Your crimes are exposed. Killing me won't save you." "Maybe not," Price acknowledged, his voice taking on a maniacal edge. "But it'll sure make me feel better before they catch me." He raised his gun, taking deliberate aim at Zav. Without thinking, Harriet called out, "Price!" Both men turned at the sound of her voice. Price's momentary distraction was all Zav needed. He lunged forward, tackling the mayor despite his injured shoulder. They fell together, struggling for control of Price's weapon. Harriet slid from her saddle. The revolver Zav had given her clutched in her hand, but she didn't dare fire with the two men so closely entangled. She moved forward carefully, trying to find a clear line of sight when a shot rang out. For a terrible moment, Harriet couldn't tell who had been hit. Then Price slumped backward, blood blossoming on his chest. Zav rose unsteadily to his feet, his own gun in his hand, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "Zav," Harriet cried, rushing forward as he swayed dangerously. "I'm all right," he managed, though his face was pale with blood loss. "Just need to sit down for a minute." Harriet helped him to a nearby boulder, then quickly examined his wounds. The bullet that had struck him during the initial confrontation had torn through his shoulder, leaving an ugly but not immediately life-threatening wound. "You're losing too much blood," she told him, tearing strips from her petticoat to fashion a makeshift bandage. "We need to get you to a doctor." "Price?" Zav asked, glancing toward the still form of the mayor. Harriet checked briefly. "Dead," she confirmed. "Your shot was true." Zav nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Not how I wanted it to end. Would have preferred to see him stand trial, face the consequences properly." "He made his choice," Harriet reminded him gently, finishing the bandage. "Just as you made yours when you went after him. A choice that nearly got you killed, I might add." A ghost of a smile touched Zav's lips. "Says the woman who just rode into the middle of a standoff unarmed." "I had your revolver," Harriet pointed out, helping him to his feet as the sound of approaching horses reached them. "And I couldn't just wait below, not knowing if you were alive or dead." Zav's eyes met hers, something warm and profound in their depths despite his pain. "Thank you for that," he said softly, "for coming after me." Before Harriet could respond, the deputies arrived, quickly taking in the scene. Within minutes, they had confirmed Price's death and were helping Zav down the trail to where a wagon could reach him. Harriet rode beside him, unwilling to be separated again. The journey back to Prescott was slow and careful, with frequent stops to check Zav's wounds and allow him to rest. The doctor who attended him upon their arrival confirmed what Harriet had suspected: the shoulder wound was serious but not fatal, though he had lost a considerable amount of blood. With proper care and rest, he would recover fully. Judge Hammond, upon hearing their report, expressed regret at Price's death but satisfaction that the case was resolved. "You've done the territory a great service," he told them when he visited Zav in the small hospital ward the following day. "Both of you." Price's corruption ran deeper than even I suspected. We're still uncovering the extent of his criminal activities. "And Copper Creek?" Harriet asked. "What will happen there now?" "The town council will elect an interim mayor," the judge explained. "And there will be a proper investigation of Sheriff Dobbs and others who facilitated Price's schemes." As for Turner's general merchandise, he added with a smile for Harriet, the bank has already confirmed that there was no legitimate foreclosure. The store is yours, free and clear, as your uncle intended. In the days that followed, as Zav began his recovery and Harriet gave formal statements about all that had transpired, they found themselves at a crossroads. The immediate danger had passed, justice had been served, but the question of what came next loomed large between them. It was Zav who finally broached the subject one evening, a week after the showdown at Willow Creek. Harriet had come to visit him at the small room he had taken near the courthouse once he was released from the hospital. His shoulder was healing well, though he still wore a sling and would for some weeks to come. Judge Hammond offered me a position, he told her as they sat by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Deputy U.S. Marshal for the district said my actions in the Price case more than vindicated me. That's wonderful, Harriet said sincerely. Are you going to accept? Zav turned to face her directly. That depends. On what, on you, he said simply. On what you plan to do now. Will you stay in the territory, run your uncle's store in Copper Creek? Harriet had been asking herself the same question for days. I've been thinking about that, she admitted. I came west to honor my uncle's wishes to continue what he built. That hasn't changed. She paused, gathering her courage. But Copper Creek holds some dark memories now, and the store. It's just a building in the end. What matters is carrying on my uncle's legacy of honesty and fair dealing. What are you saying? Zav asked, a hint of hope in his voice. I'm saying, Harriet continued carefully, that perhaps Turner's general merchandise could relocate, to Prescott, for instance. It's a growing town with need for a good general store, and I hear the law enforcement is excellent. A slow smile spread across Zav's face, lighting his eyes in a way Harriet had rarely seen. Is that so? It is, Harriet confirmed, her own smile growing to match his. Of course, such an undertaking would require considerable advice and assistance, perhaps from someone who knows the territory well. Zav reached out with his good arm, taking her hand in his. I might know someone who fits that description. Someone who has come to care very deeply for a certain Boston-bred shopkeeper with more courage than sense. That's fortunate, Harriet replied, her voice soft as she entwined her fingers with his. Because that shopkeeper has developed rather strong feelings for a former marshal with a similar disregard for personal safety. Zav's expression grew more serious, though the warmth in his eyes remained. Harriet, when I found you in that shed, I had no idea how completely you would change my life. I was existing, not living focused only on revenge against Price. You gave me something else to fight for, something better. And you saved me, Harriet told him. Not just from that shed, but from a life half lived. I came west seeking my uncle's legacy, but I found something I never expected. She squeezed his hand gently. Something I'm not willing to give up. Zav drew her closer, his gaze intent. Then don't, he murmured. Stay. Build your store here in Prescott. Let me court you properly the way you deserve, and perhaps when the time is right. Yes, Harriet said simply, her heart too full for elaborate declarations. To all of it, yes. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Zav leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as Harriet responded in kind. It was a kiss that held promises for the future, healing for the past, and the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. 2 years later, Turner and Caldwell General Merchandise stood proudly on Prescott's Main Street, its reputation for fair prices and honest dealings making it one of the most successful businesses in town. Behind the counter, Harriet Turner Caldwell, now 6 months pregnant with their first child, smiled as her husband entered, his marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. "Busy morning?" Zav asked, leaning across the counter to kiss her. "The usual Saturday rush," Harriet replied, her hand automatically moving to the gentle swell of her belly. "Judge Hammond stopped by, says the last of Price's conspirators has been sentenced. It's finally over." Zav's expression softened as he covered her hand with his own. "It was over the day I broke that latch and carried you out of that shed," he said quietly. "Everything since then has just been the beginning." Harriet smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate meeting in the desert to a life built on love, trust, and shared purpose. "The beginning," she echoed, leaning forward to kiss him again. "I like the sound of that."